Where'd you meet Pop?
Well, I was going to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, and everybody had canoes up there, and I persuaded my mother and father to let me buy a canoe. It had a hole in it and it had a big patch, but it was a canoe. And you see, Madison is surrounded by lakes: Monona, Mendoza, Waubesa, Kegonsa, and Windgra. And I learned right away, you had to learn the lakes that surrounded Madison. So they gave me a canoe, and I stayed for summer school. And my mother was always crazy to go back to school, wanted to learn more always. So she came up and rented rooms in the same place that I had a room, and brought Suzanne. Suzanne was 4 years old, I think, or maybe 4 years old, so that my mother could take some courses. And she got somebody to take care of Suzanne in the meantime. So we stayed there for the summer school, and then came back and went to saw Niagara Falls and came on down. And my father had been left with Margaret, my sister, and he didn't know what to do with Margaret because she was so lonesome and didn't have friends. So he would take her out to the Bannockburn Golf Club out here just on the edge of the district line along Western Avenue. All of that area was Bannockburn. It was an old farm. And he taught her how to play golf. And Louis was home from school then, and I think he had some kind of a summer job, or maybe not. I don't think he was working. And he was out there playing golf, and your father could spot a golf ball anywhere, no matter what. And Margaret and I went over to play tennis, and he came back from playing golf, and he had been dating Margaret. And he said hi, and walked over to the tennis court and said, "Do you want some golf balls?" And Margaret said yes, she would. And he took his bag and he held it upside down, and the balls just covered the tennis court. Never saw so many balls in your life. And she introduced him to me. So he said, was she going to be home that night? Could he come over and see her? And she said yes, because she was crazy about him. She was 4 years younger than Lou, but was quite thrilled. She was in high school to have a college boy ask her for a date. And my father and Mr. Prentiss were close friends out there. They played golf all the time together. So that night, Louis came out to see Margaret. And we lived in Chevy Chase on what they called Keokuk Street. And it was just a block east of Connecticut Avenue. And my mother, I had a friend, Josephine Bedinger, and I had asked Joe to come out that night. So my mother came to me and she said, "I don't want you to go on the porch tonight. Margaret has a date with Louis Prentiss, and I don't want you to go out there." So I said, "Well, sure." I didn't make any difference to me. And I had a ukulele that I brought back from college, and I could play the ukulele, and I had all these ditties that I could sing. And Josephine was there, and we sat on the couch, and we were playing the ukulele and singing the ditties, and not even thinking about Margaret out on the porch. And Josephine was older than I. Pretty soon Margaret came in, and she said, "For heaven's sakes, come on out and help me entertain Louis." My mother had said, "Don't go on the porch." So I didn't go on the porch, but Louis came on in with Margaret, and we had a piano there, and Louis could play the piano, and I could play the ukulele, and we were singing and having a wonderful time. And when he said goodnight that night, he asked me if he could have a date the next night. And I said, sure. And my mother was very angry. But Louis came out, and he had a little car, his father's car, and he took me riding all around the basin, down there, all around there. And so he brought me home, and the next night he asked me for a date the next night, and I said, yeah. And so it got to be that he was coming out at noon to play golf with me, and then he'd come back at night and take me for a ride in the car. He didn't have any money, so we just either took a ride in the car or we took walks. And in 2 weeks, he asked me to marry him. 2 weeks. And I came up that night to my mother, and she was barely speaking to me. And I said, Louis asked me to marry him. And she said, well, what did you tell him? I said, yes. It was the most unheard of thing in my life. I couldn't imagine that anybody would want to marry me. And I just said, yeah, sure. Just like that. I thought he was awfully cute. I thought he was wonderful and all that, but as far as being madly in love with him, I wasn't, because I hadn't known him long enough. But I knew that I liked to be with him. And I can remember the first time we were driving down around the basin, and he reached over and he put his hand on my hand. And that was the first time he ever touched me. And then when he asked me to marry him, just like that, I couldn't get over it. I couldn't get over it. I was just laughing. And my mother couldn't help it. She couldn't help it. She thought it was wonderful too. She wanted to get rid of me. So he went back to college, and he left me with a little ring that had the seal of the SAE seal on it, and his pin, his fraternity pin. And so that fall, Allison Miller began asking me for dates, and I didn't care for him, but he was a lot older than I. I was 21 and he was 31, about 10 years old. And he had a lot of money, and he had a Bearcat Stutz, a red Bearcat Stutz. And I was going around Washington in that Bearcat. Every time he'd come out, he'd take me out, and then he would take me out to dinner up in the mountains, Sugarloaf Mountain, and places that I'd never been. I'd never had anything like that. I'd never gone to hotels for dinner and things like that. And Louis was coming home for Christmas, and I told Allison wanted a date with me, and I said I couldn't have a date with him because I had a friend coming to see me, and he kept asking me the name, and finally I said it was Louise. I didn't want to tell him that I was going to see another boy. It was Louise. Well, we could get somebody for Louise. I said, I don't think so. And anyway, I went out with Louis, and Allison knew I was going to be at this dance down on Church Street, and he came in there and he saw me with Louis. But Louis went back to school, and then Allison began dating me really hard. And I don't think you want to hear all this.
Yeah, I do. I've never heard anything like that.
Well, I got so upset and so nervous because my mother could see that it was a wonderful chance to marry money. And she was all for pushing it. And my father wasn't sure. And Allison was about 5'6" and sort of 5 by 5. He was rotund, and he was getting bald. And he could do anything because he had all the money in the world. But I just couldn't see him. But I was having a wonderful time going to dancing, but I didn't like to dance with him. But I know one time he even bought a diamond ring that had the biggest diamond I ever saw. It was pear-shaped, and he had it designed himself. This beautiful diamond, and he had horseshoes in little diamonds on each side. And just the fact that that had horseshoes on, I tell you, I can't tell you how I felt. It wasn't, I couldn't wear horseshoes, but this beautiful pair of diamonds. But I didn't know what diamonds cost. And he gave it to me, and I put it on my finger the next day and showed it to Margaret, and Margaret said, "I think you're crazy." And it jacked me right up on my heels that she could say that. And my father asked me to go down to the office with him. He was in the forecasting business, you know. He was in the Weather Bureau down there near Columbia Hospital for Women. And he asked me he had to make the forecast at night. And he asked me to go down with him. He wanted to talk to me, but he couldn't talk to me. And I had the strangest feeling. I couldn't talk to him. I knew he wanted to talk about Allison, but he couldn't do it. And he couldn't draw it out on me. And so in about a week, Allison asked me to go down to this hotel that I was telling you about. What is the name of that?
The Boardman Park.
Boardman Park, for dinner and dancing. And he asked my mother. I didn't know why. So my mother went with us on this date. And she didn't dance, but he danced. And that night, when we came home, she said, "I know you can't marry Allison." I could tell it. I didn't want to be touched by him. I didn't know it showed, but I didn't want to be touched by him. And so I got, he was pushing me so hard, and I began to think I was going to have a nervous breakdown because I was throbbing in my neck all the time. I didn't know what to do. And I knew that everybody in Washington knew that I was out in Allison's Bearcat Studs. So one day, I asked him to drop me off at Father Prentiss's, at the Prentiss's house. And he left me there. And I had called up and asked Mother Prentiss if I could talk to Father Prentiss, because Louis had written that he didn't think that his father was going to send him the money to come home. And it was coming up June, and I didn't know what to do. Here I was. I know what they were thinking, but they didn't know what I was thinking of inside. And so he took me up in his library alone, And I talked to him, and I asked him if Louis was coming home. That I had to know. I had to know. And I was very upset. I didn't cry or anything, but he could tell I was nervous. And he always did like me. When Louis first brought me home, he was shaving up in his bedroom, and he just had on his shirt and suspenders and trousers, and he was in front of a chiffonier, and he had his shaving mug and all, and he was shaving up there at night. And I felt so embarrassed at being taken into his bedroom. But we were going to a dance, and I know I looked well. And his eyes just sparkled when Louis introduced me to him. He really did like me. So when I met him in his library, and I asked him about Lou, we waited a little while, and then he said, "I'll send for him." And so we all went down to the station, and Louis came home. Because I think they had told Louis that I was dating. Where, have you lost with somebody? Come on, wake up.
Come on, let's go walk.
Go on. Everybody out.
Ollie, ollie, oxen.
Go on, go on. Hurry up. So he came in at night, and I knew then I hadn't made a mistake. I don't know why I'm telling you all this.
Because we want to hear it.
Oh, it's just my romantic time.
Yeah. I think that's a real nice love story, don't you?
Well, it was my whole life was a love story with your father. He really was. He was the only man in my whole life. And that's why it was so hard for me when he suddenly, instead of being a husband to me, I was his mother.
When he started to
And
fail.
I couldn't take that.
When he started to fail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I couldn't take it. He just wanted me for a mother. Needed protection and shelter and care. So